Today on CodeDependent, we're going to be talking about realistic motion. So we've done some of this in previous episodes where we talked about stretching and squashing and using some traditional animation techniques and applying it to flex and animation on the screen through these programmatic libraries. Today we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be looking at principles of anticipation, building anticipation for a motion that's about to occur, as well as follow through. What happens when you get to the end of a motion? So I doubt we ever come to a full stop when we're running. Instead, you may stop and then some of your body may carry on, and depending on your body type, maybe a lot of your body actually carries on. So what can we do to actually reflect that more realistic movement on the screen with some of our components or objects? We're also going to feed in some motion blur in there because it's just so darn easy and fun to play with. But it also gives more smooth movement and motion on the screen. So we're going to look at this simple application that I wrote called speeding button. So we have one button up here that triggers an animation. This button is going to move from the left to the right. So let's see it do that now. So that was pretty quick. So we'll run it again. So you can see a couple of different things happen. One is that there's some anticipation here building where the button sort of backs up a little bit before it launches into the animation, right? And then when it gets to the end, you can see part of the button actually carries on past. So the bottom of the button actually stops on a dime, but the top of the button, maybe it couldn't do that because it had too much to drink the night before. And it actually carries on a little bit of movement there. And some aspects are really actually hard to see to the naked eye at real time. So I put in an exaggeration thing in there so you can actually see this happen a little bit slower. So here you can see it back up. We're really exaggerating both the movement and the time of the animation. Let's run that again. So the button backs up just up in that corner. You've got the skew happening, and then the top of the button just carries right on past when the bottom stops, and then it moves back and just sort of wobbles into place there. A little bit more of a realistic motion, maybe not for a button, but for a body that may be moving, a physical body that's moving around. And then we've got some motion blur that we can apply as well, so that as we're moving, you can see a little bit of blur applied to the button, which gets a little bit more of the feel of smooth motion because maybe you don't have choppy artifacts from whatever timing issues or CPU issues you're having. Instead, the motion is blurred in the meantime so that the eye is happier to view this as one continuous animation instead of more of the stop capture approach of frames, which, you know, when put together are reasonably smooth, but maybe you want it to be a little bit more smooth and continuous to most of the viewers. So now let's look at the interesting part, which is the code. So we have a simple UI here. We have the button that triggers it all, and it triggers it by handling a click event and saying, okay, when this thing is clicked, I want you to switch your state. So we've defined some state attributes that basically place the button either over on the left or over on the right. So it's going to switch the state, and that triggers a transition that's going to run with all of these effects. The button itself, there's nothing to it. We've just placed this button at a certain point in space, and then we're going to be moving it with the effects. And that's going to be dependent upon the state properties, which place the object over to the right. We've got a couple of checkboxes to do the exaggeration motion. I did that basically for the video to make it easier to see what's actually going on behind the scenes. So this is actually an important point, that you want your UI effects and your animations to be subtle. You don't want to make them so beautiful and awesome and drawn out that your users think, well, that's pretty, but I'm wasting my time here watching this thing happen. So you want to make them very subtle so that the user appreciates them, but not in any really conscious way. So I wanted to make the thing pretty quick by default, but then be able to slow it down so that I could actually describe what was going on a little bit more closely. So we've got the checkboxes there that handle a couple of different properties that feed into the animations above. The states, as I said, they define a simple set property that moves the button over to the right. And then the effect itself is in the transitions block. So the transitions block says, okay, well, I have a couple of transitions. One is this very simple one that simply scoots the thing back into place. It says, okay, when you're moving from state 2 back into the default state, just move the thing. We'll just do the fancy animation on the movement over to the right. So we've got the main transition, which is going into state 2. And we've got a sequence. So we want a sequence of things to happen. We've got this anticipation phase where the button is going to rear back a little bit before it actually launches into the main movement from left to right. And then when it hits the right, it's got this other phase where it's going to go past a little bit of follow through as the button comes to a stop, and then the wobble as it settles into place. So we've got a sequence where the first thing is to actually anticipate. And we do this by running a parallel effect, which is going to change the skew of this object as well as move the object. So a skew is a very geeky linear algebra, matrix-oriented thing where you're basically changing the shape of the object according to elements in the matrix. So matrices are used for performing a lot of stuff in graphics, like scaling an object and translating an object, moving it around on the screen. And a skew is one that is not used as often but seemed appropriate for this point, where I didn't want to actually shift the entire button to the left. Then it would look very wooden and robotic. Instead, I actually wanted to give it some form and life and actually deform it a little bit for the anticipation. So we changed the skew factor in this thing by changing it in the matrix itself. So you can see here there's a property setter for the button skew value that we're going to animate, and this grabs the matrix from the button and it changes the C value. I love that name, it's so meaningful. And then it sets the matrix on the button again, and that simply changes the skew over time between the values that were the N values, this 0 skew over to whatever angle we wanted. It sets the matrix, and then we get the deformed button that we were looking for. So that's the first part of the animation. We're going to skew this thing and we're going to move it at the same time, because in Flash, on the Flash platform, things are located by their upper left point. So if we actually change the skew of the object without moving the object at the same time, then we would basically get the button moving to the right instead of the effect that I'm actually looking for is I want it to be skewing to the left, but essentially staying in place, anchored at the bottom. So I just need to do a parallel move as I'm skewing this thing. Okay, so that's done. The anticipation phase is over. Now what I want to do is skew the thing back to 0 and then scoot the button along. So we have a parallel animation again. We're going to be moving from the place where it's at right now over to the right. And we're going to be animating the button skew as we go. So we were skewed over to the left, and then as we move over to the right, we're going to be getting back into place. So by the time we get to the right-hand position, then the skew will be back to 0, and we'll just have this rectangular object again. And you should notice, too, that I'm using a linear ease. Normally, I would use a nonlinear motion here, but linear is actually appropriate in this particular case because I actually wanted to have a constant motion so that when it hits the right, it's still moving, because then I want to do that follow-through effect that we had and then slowly slow down that over time. So we've got these two things happening. We're moving the button. We're also skewing it at the same time. And then we have a sequence. And this is the motion blur. So if someone's toggled the motion blur on, then we detect that here and we say, OK, I want you to animate up to an X blur of 20. I don't want to blur in the Y direction because it's not moving in Y. Instead, I just want to expand things out and blur them in the X direction. And I want it to happen gradually. So we're going to go from a non-blurred state quickly up to a blurred state, and then down at the end of the animation back down to a non-blurred state. And that gives us motion blur over the main course of this animation in the middle. So the next step in our sequence is that we're going to get over to this right and to the right, and we're going to do a follow-through where we again skew the button and the top of the button goes over to the right, and then we're going to sort of wobble back and settle into place. So here we're animating again the skew and the move. We're skewing, and we don't want to shift at the same time on the bottom. We want to anchor the bottom, so we're going to move in the opposite direction from the skew. So we animate the skew using an animate property, and then we do a move at the same time to make sure that X stays where it's supposed to. And then we do the settle using an easing function that we haven't seen yet by using an elastic ease. So we're basically saying, OK, well, I want you to, again, animate the skew. So now we've got this button over to the right, and it's skewed over there. And what we want to do is settle back to a 0 skew. But we'd kind of like to do that over time and settle it into place. And we can use an elastic ease for that, which is basically going to oscillate around the value that we want, getting smaller and smaller oscillations over time until the animation is done and we're at 0. So we're going to animate the button skew using the elastic ease, and we're also going to move it at the same time because you don't want the button to be shifting around doing this jello thing at the time. Instead, you want the button to be, the bottom to be anchored as the top is settling into place. And that is the animation. So that's how to apply the principles, old animation principles of follow-through as well as anticipation and some nice motion blur for smoothing out the movement of the button to get some animation in the UI, in particular to get more lifelike animation, something that looks a little bit like cartoon animation, something that may not be appropriate for buttons, but which in certain circumstances can enhance the reality of your application or your UI. If you want to check out the code for this application or for other related stuff, go to my blog at graphics-geek.blogspot.com.